Call to order. Thank you. Thank you for starting the recording, and I'd like to begin my first corporate governance committee meeting as chair. And I think really the first thing I will do, even though he is not here, is say that I have very, very big shoes to fill, because John Johnson was an extraordinary board member and chair, and I will miss him personally. He was brilliant, added a really nice view from the upstate New York, and his family had a long history of being a member of the board. So I know this is one of many accolades that will start the day or evening or 2 days, but I wanted to add mine. So anyway, even though it's not technically on the agenda, it will always be on my agenda. So the first order of business will be a review of the minutes of the March 1st Governance Committee meeting. I think everyone here has had more than enough time to look at it and review it and see if they have any comments. Are there any comments? There being no comments, I would like to ask for the approval of the minutes. But before I do, I want to make note that although John Johnson is not here, the three members of the official members of the governance committee are here: Joan, Al, and myself, as well as numerous other board members, including Lisa Gomez, Janice McKenzie, Gerard Romsky, and I think Ken Evans somewhere up there on the screen, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Joan. Do I have a second? Thank you, Al. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? There being no opposed, I will consider the minutes approved. The next matter will be the annual review of the existing policies regarding governance, the charter and the governance principles, as well as disposition of real property and the mission statement. So first off, let's go to Sarah for the governance committee charter review. Sarah.
Great, thank you. We will be reviewing some of the governance documents at today's meeting and the other half at the March board meeting. Today, as the chair mentioned, we have a number of items before us. The first two are the Corporate Governance Committee Charter and the Governance Principles. These require a review by the committee only. There's no action per se required, and they do not need to go to the full board tomorrow. Staff is not recommending any changes to either of these documents at this time. So the committee simply needs to review them and note that that has been done for the record. Ms. Chair?
Okay, does everyone had a chance to look at the governance charter and principles? Any comments? Okay, I don't hear any. So the annual review is complete. And Sarah, would you now cover the next item on the agenda, which is the review of the mission statement and performance metrics?
Yes, thank you. So the Public Authorities Law, Section 2824A, does require that DASNY's mission statement and performance measures and metrics be reviewed and approved annually by the board. So the first step is for this governance committee to review them. The committee may recall that last year at this time, the committee did review. We made a change to incorporate metrics regarding service-disabled veteran-owned businesses. Those changes were made at the March meeting. So at this meeting in the fall, the committee needs to review them. There's no subsequent changes since that change was made in March. And we will therefore be back on schedule with reviewing these items at the fall meeting. So again, pursuant to the Public Authorities Law, the mission statement and performance metrics need to be reviewed by this committee and by the board. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Again, we have all had a chance to review the mission statement, and thank you, Sarah, for summarizing as well as the performance metrics. Do I have a motion to recommend approval of to the full DASNY board at tomorrow's meeting?
So moved.
Al, and a second?
Second.
Very good. And the next item, finally, the annual review of guidelines pertaining to disposition of certain property, which I would like, let's see, I think Matt is going to review that, or are you, Sarah?
Nope, just real quick, it's time for the annual review of the guidelines regarding the disposition of certain property of DASNY. No changes are recommended by staff at this time. The committee and the board do need to review on an annual basis those guidelines. So we'll need a motion to recommend those to the full board for review, and then we can move on to the bylaws after that, Madam Chair.
Do I have a motion to approve, and so that the full DASNY board can approve it?
I make the motion.
I'll second.
Very good. Thank you, Al. And finally, the meat and potatoes of what we have all been doing actually over the past 2.5 years, which is notwithstanding everything going on, we have been meeting by Zoom. So this in part codifies some of what we've been doing and also really allows us to meet remotely under other situations. So I hope everyone on the committee has reviewed it. I hope other people have had a chance as well, because it really does pertain to the entire board. It's one of those matters that I took particular interest in myself. Anyway, Sarah, why don't you go over the changes for the committee and the board members and DASNY members here?
Okay, thank you. That was a good lead in, so thank you for setting that up. As the committee members and the rest of the board knows, our current section 3.7 of the DASNY bylaws has been in existence for quite some time, and it is no longer current in light of some revisions that have been made to the open meetings law. So the proposed revisions do take into account the most recent updates to the open meetings law, which authorize the board to meet via video conference. And a couple of things about this. The video conferencing can take place from more than one location as long as members of the public are authorized to also be at those sites. So, you know, if the New York City office and the Albany office are open to the public, members can meet in both places, and that is a valid meeting. The other thing that the recent revisions to the open meetings law do is authorize members to participate from private locations where the public is not allowed. You know, for example, their home is the best example. In the event of what's defined as extraordinary circumstances. Now, the board can determine what would constitute those extraordinary circumstances for DASNY purposes. The list provided in the open meetings law is not exhaustive. So staff discussed this. I've discussed it with Beryl and with the board chair. The list that is in the draft in the materials includes, you know, illness, disability, religious observance, travel of a business or personal nature that causes the member to be more than 3 hours away from a meeting site, an election on the day of a meeting for which the member is eligible to vote, inclement weather, adverse travel conditions, caregiving responsibilities, or other, you know, unexpected events at the discretion of the chair. So again, that would allow someone to participate from their home, which does not have to be open to the public, as opposed to those circumstances where Members can participate from the Buffalo office, the Albany office, the New York City office, as long as those have been open and noticed to the public. As we've been doing, the meetings will be recorded. A transcript and minutes will be available on the DASNY website thereafter. And the public would be provided information as to how to access the meeting by Zoom or in person, should they so choose. So that is that's the synopsis of what these amendments do. Section 3.7 would be replaced in its entirety. The other thing I'll just mention is that the old section 3.7 authorizes telephonic meetings, which are no longer allowed by the open meetings law. So to participate by video conference, members have to be seen, they have to be heard, and cannot just dial in. And with that, Madam Chair, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Madam Chair, may I offer a comment?
I would love to hear any and all comments, especially yours, President,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The rewrite of section 3.7 required some really intense wordsmithing. And I think that staff has done a terrific job in delivering up to the board and to the committee first for its consideration. An excellent piece of work. I read it. And frankly, Sarah, I can't find anything wrong with it. So thank
I
you.
think that is the highest form of compliment. Mr. Chair.
It's a great piece of work. Thank you very much. That's it, Madam Chair.
Well, I think we also have the advantage of having lived through a lot of this already. So it's not really a theoretical change to the bylaws. It's very practical and meaningful too. So not that all the other changes are not extremely meaningful, but this we are like, well, what about last year? So anyway, does anyone else? Joan, do you have any comments?
My only comment is, I think the extraordinary events, the definitions or the examples are good ones. They really did cover almost every circumstance. I thought that was great.
How about if anyone else here, either from Dazzny or other board members, have any questions or comments? No.
The Met playoff game?
Yeah, no, that's actually the Met
Extraordinary event.
It's around, actually around to be scheduled governance committee. I think that in itself is really beyond any of these significant circumstances. Actually, the stadium is publicly accessible. It is.
Good.
Hey, it'd be quite a large meeting though, 44,000 people, but I'm with you guys. I'll be there anyway. Anyway, aside from the demise of my team.
Chair, one question.
Yes,
We are voting to recommend to the full board.
yes, we are asking, I'm asking for a motion to recommend approval to the full DASNY board tomorrow. Do I have a motion?
You got it.
Joan, thank you.
Second.
Al, there you go. Thank you. So there being a motion, is there any objections to this? Okay, everyone in favor, aye.
Aye.
And great. Now I think that is the last matter. Sarah, thank you. You did an extraordinary job, really.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for your first. I just read. I'm good at reading. Kudos to you.
One last thing. Yeah.
Oh, is there?
Oh, no, you're right.
Downgraded you.
Yeah, you just got it. That just actually got thrown on the agenda that I received. Thank you, Amanda, as I was sitting here, the procurement guideline overview,
Yes.
which is not in the packet that I got, but is in a separate email agenda that I received. Thank you. There's a reason you're the president. So, the guidelines, procurement guideline overview. Are you going to do that, Sarah, or is Matt?
No,
Matt?
that is Matt Moore, our Director of Procurement, so we can turn it over to him.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to give you a little high-level overview of procurement and then talk about what we've been doing for the last 3 years to kind of take a hard look at DASNY's procurement guidelines and propose that the board, evaluate and hopefully adopt them at future board meetings for implementation. So DASNY's procurement team, we touch all aspects of DASNY. We do construction, financings, day-to-day operations. We do a myriad of different types of procurements. We do competitive bids, quotations, centralized contracts, best value. There's a way to procure a contract. We're trying to figure out how to do it to get the best value for the state. We typically use either single award procurements where it's a one-for-one procurement or a contract or a PO. But at the same time, we also do term awards where we will engage with multiple vendors and issue $0 term contracts or empanelments. We typically use those for architects, engineers. We do it for underwriters, legal counsel. Really, we look to see where it makes the most sense to have that level of empanelment and coverage around the state to provide our services. Procurement is myself, Matthew Moore. I'm the director of procurement, and Michael Clay. He's the co-director, senior director of procurement and OPG. And this is my team. We've got Wayne Benjamin, who's chief of job contracting, Aaron Butler, chief of construction, Tom Christian, who's assistant director in the opportunities program, Kristen Costello, who's our manager of purchasing, Letitia Negron, who's also an assistant director of opportunities program, and Kara Mallard, who is our chief of professional services. So why we're here today. DASNY's procurement guidelines were adopted in 2001, and they've had 10 amendments over the last 21 years. At the last board meeting in December, I believe it was your predecessor, asked if it was time for us to take a holistic approach and kind of revisit our guidelines. And I'm sorry he's not here to see this because I was working on this for him. After that board meeting, I went back and I looked at, kind of really what was the best practice that were out there. And I started kind of at the top. I looked at the statutes. I looked at the authority budget office. Then I looked at our peers in state government, Thruway Authority, Empire State Development, EFC, OGS. I really wanted to see what was the rest of the world doing. And what I discovered is almost without fail, every entity that I looked at had recently updated their guidelines. So we were not far off in time and space where everyone else was. I think people recognized it was time, and the procedures, the approach had evolved almost unanimously wherever I looked. So with that said, what I did is I took kind of a comprehensive approach. I wanted to combine our policy and our guidelines into a single cohesive document. At the time, there were aspects of our policy that was redundant of what was in our guidelines. And then within our guidelines, we stated policy statements. And at times when we made an update, we had to update in two separate places, and it really became a little unwieldy. So the goal was to try to combine a policy and a guideline into single policy and guideline approach that spoke to our entire process. I also wanted to look at this from a different perspective, and our existing guidelines, for the most part, track the requirements of 2879, the Public Authorities Law. And while we complied with it, the working document itself was a little clunky and was challenging to work with. So my approach was to modernize the approach so that as you read through the guidelines, you're effectively working your way through the procurement process at a very high level. You start with the statement of what our policy is, which is to be competitive. And then you work through selection, determination of need, contracting method, how am I going to conduct the procurement? What are the principles of conducting a procurement? Vendor responsibility, contractual provisions. Almost as a high level, as you read through the guidelines, you're working your way through the process of making a decision about how I'm going to conduct a procurement, all the way through approvals and reporting. So it's a little more intuitive approach, and that's really where we've moved. Can you go back one? So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've got for new guidelines. Much of what's there is a reorganization of what we have, and it's very, very much identical language. It's just reorganized. But so a black line really wasn't going to work. It would have, I don't think we would have been able to have read it. So fundamentally, the procurement guidelines don't change DASNY's policy or position with regards to procurement. It reinforces our commitment to compliance, competition, fairness, diversity and inclusion, while providing the necessary safeguards and controls. So it fundamentally does not change our approach or our policy objectives with regard to procurements. So what's new? There's a lot to read. It's a long document. I'm going to point out a few of the items that I think just want to draw people's attention to, because they are a little bit new. Some of them are statutory, and then others are really just a shift in, again, my approach as to how I wanted to lay the guidelines out. Board exempt procurement contracts. This is more of what I would say is a practical approach. And we've run into this recently in a few instances where mainly we're procuring software, internal operating systems. There's a system that we procured for timekeeping, but also has a module for HR. So the question is, do we procure a separate unrelated entity, an unrelated procurement where the systems don't feed? So the goal is to try to create some operational efficiencies. And if you read through that definition of board exempt, it really just goes into a little more clarity as to what we're trying to accomplish operationally, where there's the typical monopolies, hotels, direct flow publications where you have to publish in Rochester, New York. I don't have any room for competition there. So it's more operational consistency, what makes sense from an organizational standpoint. We also address discretionary purchases, and looking at what other authorities were doing. They focused on the authorization of the legislation to have an informal process. And by definition, in our old procedure, we had to advertise, which by definition is a formal procedure. So we've lifted that requirement for mandating that we do advertisements when it's practical, but it doesn't prevent us from also going through that process and advertising. It just gives us a little more flexibility, as long as it's fair, reasonable, there's competition, and we're comfortable with the price. And it just gives a little more latitude with regard to the discretionary purchase process. We also added a provision that's going to allow us to do empanelments for emergency contracts. We're frequently faced with scenarios where we have to respond quickly to emergencies, but by the time we get the procurements in place with the insurance, it keeps repeating itself, but we didn't have a good mechanism to put it in place. So we're going to treat the empanelment of emergency contracts very much like we would treat a sole or single source contract. We're going to empanel them, contract with them, get the insurance, make sure they've got the appropriate vendor responsibility levels. And when an emergency happens, we can respond immediately. We can write a work order, get them on the site, and we've got all of the requirements that we need in order to respond for ourselves or our clients. And it's a little bit of a challenge that we deal with today. We also added a provision with regard to,
No. I never want the audit folk to drive the business. It's the business that's important. We do what we have to do to catch up. Discretionary purchases, you're not worried about it. Just curious to know that you thought about the audit impact of discretionary purchases. I'm sure you have, but I'd like to hear that for the record, for the committee.
How we would use it, or what would the internal controls would be?
The internal controls. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Okay,
That's
yeah,
what I'm thinking
so what? This is something we're gonna have to define a procedure,
about. Okay.
which we're gonna have to get to, because we've changed this process. Currently today, Michael Clay, my co-director, if there's a program that's eligible for going through a discretionary purchase, he evaluates whether or not there's adequate competition in that field. He checks databases, indices, see who's available, and would require, whether or not we can or can't go through. That's for processes that are below the $50,000 threshold. So in an instance where we were to decide we're not going to advertise, would be a judgment call on the part of Michael and I, or the procurement, and again, how we lay it out in the procedures. Thought would be, we have to make sure that we're getting adequate competition.
Sure.
And it would have to be, we solicit 5 prices, 5 quotes. Do we do an outreach?
Yeah.
Do we do an email blast to everybody on OGS state contract to an approach? Those are kind of in my head where I'm going, because there is the potential for some abuse, and I'm trying to make sure we've got the appropriate internal control in place.
That's all I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
And does like Ruben or Nadine or whoever, or Paul, do they sort of finally sign off on that at the end, or like that purchase, like on a discretionary?
Presently
basis?
today, no. As I said, we've got to develop the procedures, and I would meet with, Paul and Ruben, or some of the other internal audit, internal controls, to make sure we're comfortable with what the approach is. And the thought is, it doesn't mandate that we go this process. It was really just to align DASNY's guidelines with where other authorities were. This is ESD's approach, Throughway Authority's approach for discretionary. They typically require, I think, 3 quotes, a minimum of 3 quotes. I would be looking for probably more competition than that. I'd want to make sure that we've got engaged with as many farms as we could. And that would be
And I guess it depends on what you're looking to buy.
exactly. Exactly.
Slightly different question, but in case it's an exemption where it's a single or sole source, then Ruben, or you can delegate to myself if there's no competition that's justified, those Ruben will have to approve.
Yeah.
You wanna-
I'm good.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just
Thank you,
ask a
Matt.
question?
Yeah. Can you go back ones?
Jump back one.
We also,
Sorry.
Joan has.
Okay, Joan has a question.
I'm just curious, your board exempt procurement contracts, that kind of like causes me some pain, just the sound of it. Aren't they really single source? I mean,
they are, but they've been blessed by the board as being sole single source that we're effectively approving in advance. And they've been in place since 2001. We've had these provisions, and again, they speak mostly for software.
yeah, which to me would be like a single source
Yeah.
to do an
Yeah.
upgrade. It just causes me some consternation.
It
The
kind of.
language, right?
It's
You're
language.
It is,
It's
yeah.
not the fact.
Yeah.
No, that's right, exactly, not the fact,
I
right?
think in the guidelines that we've always specified particular items that we consider it, for example, we use National Grid as
Yes.
an energy provider.
Sure.
We don't require that to go up to the president's level to get a specific, so saying it's being acknowledged to the board that there are certain types of services. Although any type of procurement, if we were buying, a new fire alarm system for a building and it's tying back, then those types of non-identified exempt contracts do get approved by
So
Ruben.
in other words, like if you had a Salesforce and you used it for a certain aspect and then you wanted to enhance and upgrade it, that would be considered a board exempt procurement contract, and Ruben, you would not have to approve that? Even though it could be $250,000? I see, okay.
Are you comfortable with that?
Do you approve single source?
I do.
I'm just confused why the different, yeah, that seems to be significant. That example I used.
Well, I guess the other, the corollary is.
Yeah,
For contracts above a certain amount, no matter where they come from, there are approval requirements.
oh, okay,
So.
Okay,
if
so in
you
that
look at one
case, you would-
In that specific example. they
Gotcha.
come by different way.
okay, gotcha.
So to answer that question, currently, right now, the guidelines do require any operating contract to be approved by the board if it exceeds $300,000.
Right, I did see that, right.
And that's been in there for many years. And we're actually tightening that up a little bit as well to include any, again, it's a clarity because we actually had to interpret it, and I wanted to make sure it was clear to include both amendments, renewals, and options. So thought is we'll be in a better position to get those contracts above those thresholds to the board when it's time for approval.
There's only a finite number of those as well. You're not, you could count them, they're a dozen, 100. I would say small amount.
I can check from a procurement.
Just
report
globally,
standpoint, yeah.
just broadly speaking, I'm not holding you to it, but it's a very limited number. Is that right?
It tends to be very limited in scope. Today, they tend to be utility companies and software. That's where we're using a majority, if not all of those instances. It involves IS licenses, software, and we're starting to run into it a little bit with, again, just giving us that operational flexibility with regard to operating systems, because there's a lot of interaction between you procure one system that can't speak to another system when you could have just as easily expanded one of those systems that you already had. And if you read through the definition of board exempt, I think you'll get a much better clarity as to how we're trying to provide some guidelines around those very narrow instances. Okay. Unsolicited proposals. That's a new concept that we're adding this time around. Again, to give us the flexibility to respond to potential ideas or concepts that get brought to us by independent third parties on the outside looking to potentially address a need of a client or address the need of a client or a program or a need. We're trying to make sure that we've got the adequate guideline and adequate reference within our guidelines. And then there's an entire section dedicated to creation of the procedures and how we're going to advance those. It does require the president's approval for any initiative that comes in through an unsolicited proposal. And generally we see this more, I think, in like the P3 world, but we're trying to make sure that we've got adequate flexibility within our guidelines to address whatever projects or client needs may come through.
And you advertise that, or you?
That is one of the topics that we've talked about, is potentially having, a period of time where during this period of time, we'll accept unsolicited proposals, or how do we deal with them if they just come in and throughout the year? I think it's a relatively new concept that the state is still kind of dealing with, and we're trying to get ahead of it.
And just conceptually too, we're looking at the, for all our conduit issuance clients, we generally don't do any construction for them, but in the marketplace, given they've got property, they've got, assets that potentially could be monetized, we want to be clear that where we do have that construction authority and that other consulting, that our guidelines give us the appropriate flexibility to work with those private clients that we generally have not done construction work for historically, because it's really hard for us to compete, doing general construction work, but specialized areas, i.e. energy, parking, there are particular areas of focus in the P3 world that we think we could bring some consulting services to the private client base that we haven't addressed previously. And this just has made it clear in the guidelines that we can actually do that.
We did make a few changes to the advertisement section, basically just to conform with changes to statute. These have been amended to amended additions to the economic development law. Again, as I just mentioned, we've added an entire section on how to address unsolicited proposals, which recognizes that they may be received and will ultimately reference procedures that we'll put in place once they get adopted. We specifically added a procurement requirement approval with regard to OSC and state contracts. Again, it's been in statute for many years, but given the importance of maintaining that continuity and compliance, I brought that requirement into the guidelines as a best practice instead of looking to other statutes. And then finally, I added a comprehensive section of a lot of different ethical laws that are in place. We're compliant with them. We have been compliant and always have been. And again, given the importance of the guidelines and the policies with regards to procurement, I thought it was incredibly important to pull all of these concepts into a single document as again, just a reminder of how important it is as public servants to maintain that, arm's length, avoid the appearance of impropriety and provide a framework for the ethical conduct of procurements going forward. And again, we've always done this. I don't want anybody to think it's new. We've always acted very ethical in our procurements, but I thought it was important to, bring those concepts into the guidelines as a reference point going forward.
That's a terrific. Because what you're talking about is something that's true. That means that it's almost as important, maybe sometimes more important, to avoid the appearance of impropriety than is the impropriety itself. And what you've done is to add this to the procurement policy. Thank you. It's a great idea.
So at a high level, those were the topics that I think, if you were to, when you read through them, you would see as being in additions or changes to what we've seen in the past. Other than that, it's mostly just a reorganization of how we've laid out the guidelines. And so question is next steps. Be reviewed by the governance committee, and at which point it'd be reported to the board, and then ultimately we would need a full board approval and vote.
Does this have to go to the Public Authority Control Board? Do they don't approve it, do they?
They don't approve it, but we will need to publish it, advertise it, and provide notification that we've updated our guidelines. Yes.
Now, this is not for the approval at this point of either the board or the committee.
Nope.
You're just giving us kind of an overview indeed before we get to review the actual meat and potatoes of it.
Exactly. Given the totality of the update, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to read through it and answer any questions if I could, kind of set the table for where we go from here. And then it would go in front of the full board, the governance committee for approval and the full board.
Well, thank you. I think it was, it took a lot of work to really take a look afresh at all of the guidelines, put them to get back, throw them, take them apart, put them back in a more coherent and practical manner. So thank you.
Madam Chair, may I ask another question?
Floor is yours.
It may not be appropriate for this meeting, Matt, but it's one I'm going to ask you later. You may not have an answer for this now. Do you have enough people? And I'm asking the question so that I can get you thinking about whether or not your staff, this is a huge job. Do you have enough people to handle it? I'm sure the president's thought about it. I'm sure the vice president's thought about it. And I'm sure you've thought about it. And I'm not asking you to answer now. For the record, I'm simply putting the question on the table. Let's talk about it.
Thank you.
It's all right. Go ahead, Joan.
I just want to say, I am kind of a procurement nerd, I'll tell you that. And I have read through this whole thing. I have a couple of questions that we'll take offline because they're kind of natty, but I have to say you did a great job. Very impressed. Very good job.
Anyway, but to the extent these impact construction, you obviously you talked to Steve and worked them through Steve and he's
Yeah.
comfortable with them, right? Because at the end of the day, it probably impacts, his sort of division more than most, so.
So Steve has
Don't
had
want to
a,
impact the whole construction by doing too much of a regulatory sort of process. That's all.
so fundamentally, we really didn't change much of how we conduct our procurements, especially for construction. We're still doing advertisements, we're still doing design bid build, we're still doing design build, we're authorized. So from that standpoint, it shouldn't fundamentally change how we're able to operate our business.
We did provide some additional clarification though on the alternative delivery, which again,
Remember, there was a big project that, the big,
ASRC.
right, that just, our process sort of stopped it from didn't stop it, but it sort of slowed down the process a bit.
We've got more, I think, in way of
A little bit more of
pre-qualification.
the.
We've given ourselves, well,
Just for
consistent
those
with law.
different
yeah,
projects, right, I know,
And by the way, I mean, legal has also been part of it.
I'm sure.
Make sure.
I
that
assume that.
Our chairman was I knew chairman was gonna ask the question sooner or later. Yes, the attorney.
I wasn't gonna ask, I assumed.
Just from an internal standpoint, I've had countless meetings with representatives from legal. I've had others from procurement review them, all of my chiefs and direct reports. Steve's given comments, Paul's given comments. I've really tried to get as much input and feedback and collaboration as possible because it does impact literally every aspect of what we do as an organization. So I wanted to make sure, A, I didn't miss something, or B, I didn't unintentionally restrict us from being able to do something that we had done in the past because of a poor wording. So far I haven't found anything that I'm gonna regret, but hopefully we're good.
Matt, I'd like to say, Matt is a recovering lawyer.
Uh,
Insight. In all seriousness, Matt and Michael and their team do a fantastic job on the procurement side. We're not an agency that just procures for ourselves. We also procure on behalf of third parties. And it's fairly complex at times, a lot of activity back and forth at times. They just done a tremendous job of making sure that everyone understands what we're supposed to be doing and process things quickly and efficiently without compromising on the values and the competitiveness of it. I also think they do a great job of prioritizing our procurements, what goes right, places here, there. Some are a little bit, as you know, some are professional procurements, some take more time than others. We're trying to do everything to support them from a technology perspective. Another thing, management, this piece of work, which is a great piece of work, but really generally the work that you do. I don't sleep over much. And thankfully, procurement's not on that list, but it sure could be. But it sure could be.
It could be.
Yes, it sure could be.
I really am blessed with a great team and they take their job very seriously and they're each in their own way bring a very necessary value to the organization and I'm thankful to have them.
Okay, I have a question. Are we gonna bring this before the board tomorrow just broadly, or we're gonna put it on the shelf, review it ourselves internally after Joan and has had a chance with her comments, Al and I? And that will be for what, Sarah, what were we discussing, the next meeting or the meeting after?
Well, we'll work with, procurement and senior staff and, bring them when they're ready. I'm not sure it'll be the next meeting, but probably later this year, beginning of next. Paul, Matt, Ruben, would you say that's accurate
Yep.
estimate?
When's the next meeting?
You and me.
Governance.
Oh, governance. Oh.
The next governance meeting is in March is the next scheduled one, but we could always schedule a, special one to the extent we needed to.
Right.
It would be that meeting.
Okay, yeah, March, that would seem logical. No reason to do a special.
I agree. I mean, unless Matt believes that there is a reason to get an approved.
21 years.
I'm anxious to roll these out and start using them. So.
But But you're using some of them already. It's just a reformat. My understanding, it's a reformat of a lot of the procedures that we have used already, or one of those dozen amendments that you articulated since over the past 20 years.
We have guidelines in place today that were fully utilized and we're meeting our needs. Again, these were really a clarification and a few instances, some expansions. But we're. we
Well, the
have-
unsolicited proposals, that was something new, right?
Yeah, there are a few instances that are new. So again, as I said, I'm anxious to get these approved in place as soon as possible. So I would defer to the
March may be too far off. So
Yeah,
that's
right.
the committee. We
Right,
should talk
well,
about that.
we'll talk
And if
about
we need a
doing
meeting, let's do it.
an intermediate meeting if we have to. There's just three of us. I think we can
Yeah,
handle
we
it.
can figure it out.
Of course, giving notice to the public.
Defer to the wisdom of the two.
Of course. Anyway, I believe now we're at the end of this meeting, thankfully, and I will re-engage the motion to adjourn.
Make motion.
Thank you, Joan,
I'll second that.
and thank you, Al, and I agree. So the meeting of the governance committee is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Just as a reminder, everybody knows